So we're going to begin, like I said, next week, no Wednesday nights. So we're going to begin 2 Samuel, but then we're going to stop and start. I think Matt is planning on just going into doing the next chapter in 2 Samuel. So after next week, we'll probably, other than the members meeting, we'll just keep on going through 2 Samuel. Technically, 2 Samuel is not a new story. So it's not like we're beginning a new tale or a new narrative or a new, context. It's just a continuation of 1 Samuel. In fact, in the Hebrew Bible, 1 and 2 Samuel is just one book. It was split apart as 1 and 2 Samuel when the Hebrew Bible was translated to Greek about 200 years before Christ or so. And I always, when we start a new book of the Bible, I always try to give you an introduction to kind of give you context, give you setting, tell you kind of where we're going, the structure of the whole book. But as you know, if you've been here any amount of time, I often find that those Bible Project videos do a whole lot better job than I could do, and they do it a whole lot quicker. They're not as verbose as I am. So we're going to play the video for 2 Samuel that just kind of outlines the book and tells you where we're headed, and then we'll get into the first chapter. Sound good? Okay. Take it away, video man.
The book of 2 Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and of blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prized soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister Tamar, and then their brother Absalom finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches the secret plan to oust his father David from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness, except this time he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, and it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin. The book concludes with a well-crafted epilogue, with stories that are out of chronological order, but they have this really cool symmetrical literary design. So the outer pair of stories come from earlier in David's reign, and they compare the failures of Saul and then of David, and how each of them hurt other people through their bad decisions. The next inner pair of stories are about David and his band of mighty men who went about fighting the Philistines. And what's interesting is that both sections have a story of David's weakness in battle. So in contrast to the victorious David of chapters 1 through 9, here we see a vulnerable David who's dependent on others for help. The center of the epilogue has 2 poems that act like memoirs, and David reflects back on his life. And he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. And he sees these as moments where God was faithful to his covenant promise to him and to his family. Both poems conclude by looking back onto the hope of God's promise of a future king who will build that eternal kingdom. Now these poems and then God's promise also connect back to Hannah's poem that opened the book. And so these key passages from the beginning, now the middle, and the end of the book bring the book's themes all together. Despite Saul and David's evil, God remained at work, moving forward his redemptive purposes. And God opposed David and Saul's arrogance, but he exalted David when he humbled himself. And so the future hope of this book reaches far beyond David himself. It looks to the future, to the Messianic king who will one day bring God's kingdom and blessing to all of the nations. And that's what the book of Samuel is all about.
Got it? So do we even need to go through the book? You already know what it's about? Okay, we're done. All right, it's BibleProject.com, and all the videos that I've watched, I have a hard time endorsing just everything this, particular ministry does because I haven't watched them all, but the ones that we've looked at are pretty good, and they just give us kind of a basic outline of where we're going. And it kind of helps us to understand how it fits into the big story of the Bible. So now you know that where we've been in 1 Samuel, you know where we're going in 2 Samuel. So chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, honestly, in my opinion, the writers didn't ask my opinion, so my opinion doesn't matter. But chapter 1 of 2 Samuel really goes with 1 Samuel, and then chapter 2 starts this new, David rising to the kingdom and all that kind of stuff. So really we're talking about the end of Saul here, and David's sorrow and his lament for Saul's death. This chapter closes the story of Saul for good and shows us how David finds out about Saul's death. And it gives us, the second part of this chapter is just a psalm. It's a funeral lament that David writes for himself and for Israel to grieve over Saul's death. So in this chapter, we get really an up-close and personal picture of David's heart as he grieves for Israel, for Jonathan, and for Saul. Now, we've seen his faith, his loyalty. We've seen him make some mistakes in 1 Samuel. But you really get a picture of David's heart here at the beginning as he is about to ascend to the kingship. So let's do this. Let's just read the whole thing, then I'll back it. Let's read the first 17 verses, which is the narrative portion, and then we'll back up and talk about them, okay? And then we'll read the whole lament psalm, and then we'll back up and talk about that. It says, after the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." And so David said to the young man who had told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And here the messenger launches into this story between verses 6 and 10. He says, "And the young man who told him said, 'By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, Here I am. He said to me, Who are you? I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, Saul, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head, and the armlet, which is an armband, could be a bracelet, that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, Where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. David said to him, How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the soldiers and says, Come here and strike him down. So he struck him down, and he died. David said to him, I love how it's, and he died. Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have put to death the Lord's anointed. All right, verses 1 through 16. Yeah, that's right. All right, I'm backing all the way up. Okay, so verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David returned from striking down the Amalekites, he was there 2 days in Ziklag, and on the third day, this guy shows up. His clothes are torn, dirt on his head. He came to David, and he immediately just falls down, paid homage. Maybe your translation says he honored him or bowed before him or something like that. So David knows good and well that Saul has been fighting the Philistines. Remember, David had been among the massive force of the Philistines that was about to go march against Saul, and he was dismissed from the army and not allowed to go. Why? They didn't trust him. They thought he would turn on them, which is probably, in my opinion, what he would have done. But why has David been killing Amalekites? Come on, y'all know this. Huh? Yeah, that's right. He got back to Ziklag, and he found that all of his people had been taken captive. They had raided, Amalekites had raided, and so he goes off and he rescues them and defeats all of those Amalekites. So he's back home from doing that for a couple of days. On the third day, this guy comes running into town with clothes torn, dirt on his head. What would that appearance tell David immediately? His appearance, torn clothes, dirt on his head. Morning. So it's not going to be good news. So this guy comes right up to David, falls down on the ground before him, and paid homage, gives honor. The translation may say several different things. But this tells you a couple of things right off the bat about this guy. First, this guy knows exactly who David is. He bows before him as if he knows this right here is the new king. And second, he knew where to find David. So he deliberately is coming to David. Ziklag is about 80 miles or so from where this battle was fought, and this guy made it in 3 days. So he doesn't just happen upon David. He's seeking David out. And he speaks to David and gives David just this terrible news. Verse 3 and 4, he said, Where do you come from? I've escaped from the camp of Israel. And he said, How did it go? Tell me. He said, The people fled. Also, many of them are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. Now, We were already told this in the text, the last chapter of 1 Samuel, 1 Samuel 31. We know Saul, Jonathan's dead. But this is the first time David is hearing this news. And it's as if he can't believe his ears. David questions this messenger saying, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And this lets this messenger launch into this story. And we're going to talk about it. I'm going a little quick right here because I want to get to this story. Let's just read it all at once and then we'll look at it. It says, young man who told him said, this is what he says, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, that's where Saul and Jonathan died, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. Behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. The Philistines were coming and attacking. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, here I am. He said, who are you? He said, I'm an Amalekite. We already read this, so we knew this. But this is the first time David's hearing he's an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because, this is his reasoning, I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. Okay, obviously, before we get into this, there's a big difference between this account of Saul's death and what we read in 1 Samuel 31, isn't there? How did 1 Samuel 31 tell us that Saul died? Said he fell on his own sword. First, what did he do? He wanted his armor bearer to kill him, and the armor bearer refused. And then it says he fell on his sword and he died. You know, so suicide is how 1 Samuel 31 presents it. This is a completely different story. Now, there are basically two theories about this. And whenever somebody tells you, whenever a preacher says, now there's three versions, it's always the last one that's right. So the first theory is that, so the two theories are this guy's telling the truth and the guy's lying, okay? So if he's telling the truth, then the timeline would go like this. Saul and his armor bearer both fall on their swords, 1 Samuel 31, and Saul is laying there dying, but he's not dead yet, even though he tried to fall on his sword. He's propping himself up by his spear, and this guy shows up, and he puts Saul out of his misery. Okay? It's possible. It's possible. And if that's true, the messenger tells David this story like I acted out of compassion. I was doing it for Saul. He asked me to. You know, I knew he couldn't survive. I knew they were coming, and he asked me to kill him, and so I did. The other theory, which I believe is correct, is that this guy is lying. 1 Samuel 31 told us that Saul's armor bearer didn't kill himself until after he saw Saul was dead. You remember? Okay? And he didn't kill himself till after Saul was dead. So he saw Saul dead and then he killed himself. And if some Amalekite showed up wanting to run Saul through, I think the armor bearer would have done something. More likely, this guy just came upon Saul's body and took the stuff off of him and came running to David. Another reason I think he's lying is because Samuel is one book in the Hebrew Bible. So 1 Samuel 31 and 2 Samuel 1 are two chapters in the same book placed side by side without any comment about how they're telling different versions of this story. The narrator doesn't tell us, and he was lying, or this is what really happened, or he just presents two what seemingly are contradictory accounts, and he doesn't give any explanation. So in 1 Samuel 31, the narrator, told us that Saul's death by suicide happened, and here it's an Amalekite that tells us the other version. And a great commentator on this book named Dale Ralph Davis, he said this: if you ever have to choose between a Bible narrator and an Amalekite, always believe the narrator, because you've never met an Amalekite you could trust. But why lie? And so I'm going to take for granted he's lying. Okay? Anybody want to push back on that? Two valid theories. He could be telling the truth. I don't think so, but I think he's lying. Why would he lie? Tim?
Well, he knew that Saul was going against David.
Yes.
He was trying probably to get a
For sure. I think that's exactly correct. Tim said that this guy made up the story. We're assuming he's lying. He made up the story because he thinks David's going to be happy. David's going to be happy that Saul's dead. He's going to be happy that this guy killed him. And it's a compassionate killing, the way he frames the story. And, possibly the new king's going to give him a reward or position or something like that in his new kingdom. I think that's very valid. And if he is lying, he for sure tells the story in a way that he seems like the good guy who really helped Saul out so he wouldn't be, tormented by the Philistines or whatever. And in verse 10, he gives David Saul's crown and his armlet. Like I said, armlet's just an armband or bracelet. We don't really know what it was for or what it is. But these items that he gives David prove that Saul's dead. But also here, you have, picture this scene here, this Amalekite presenting the crown of Israel to David, the man that God had chosen to actually wear it. The messenger was probably super proud of himself, thinking he was going to get rewarded in all kinds of ways. But with incredibly bad judgment, this guy assumes David's going to be happy to hear about Saul's death and would reward him for bringing the crown to him. And in the midst of the story, from 6 to 10, we've been talking about it, and we kind of take it for granted a little bit. But in the midst of the story, it's almost casually revealed that this guy is an Amalekite. He doesn't just come out and say, I am from Amalek. I'm a Amalekite. He says, Saul saw me and asked who he was. I said, oh, I'm an Amalekite. And so I wonder what the people standing around David, who he just rescued from the Amalekites, thought about this Amalekite messenger coming back saying, I killed Saul. But more than that, think of how ironic this is, really. God told Saul to wipe out the Amalekites. And he lost his kingdom because he failed to do so. He rebelled, really, and failed to do so. So Saul's disobedience is the only reason this guy is alive and standing here. And now an Amalekite has come to David claiming to have killed Saul. And so he used terrible judgment to think David would be happy. But you can imagine as all of this is kind of permeating in David's spirit, it's not going to be good at all. Now we're going to get to what David does to the messenger in a minute. But before dealing with the messenger, David, before he can do anything else, he just bursts into grief and mourning over Saul. In verse 11 it says, Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all of the men who were with him. Remember, the messenger, torn clothes, dirt on his head. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan, his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they'd fallen by the sword. This is probably not the response that this messenger expected. He probably expected David and his company to rejoice, celebrate. Finally, this is over. This tit for tat with David and Saul is over, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. David can be the king now, and we don't have to run and hide and all that stuff. Saul had chased David all over Israel and chased him out of Israel, actually. He tried to kill David multiple times, generally just made his life miserable for years, not to mention that Saul stood in the way of David receiving what God had promised, the throne. But none of that seems to matter to David. David is genuinely grieved over what happened to Israel and Jonathan, but the text also says he was grieved because of what happened to Saul. Why? Not rhetorical, answer. Why do you think? We're not told. Why do you think he was so grieved over Saul? This is not fake grief. This is not a show putting on because he's supposed to. We're going to see as he pens this psalm, he's really grieved over Saul. Because he's the Lord's anointed. I don't think we need to go much deeper than that. It's just the way it is. In spite of all that happened, Saul was God's anointed king. David twice would not lift a hand against Saul because he honored the king God had put in place. When God anointed him for office as king, that means holy to the Lord, even if the guy was a scumbag who was occupying the office. Same way when God anointed the priest, he's holy to the Lord, and God had anointed him king. And now that God had taken out the king, as it were, it was still a matter of sorrow and grief for David that God's anointed had died. And like I said, this isn't just performative, David tearing his clothes because that's what he's supposed to do. We're going to see in this song, he really is grieving. Saul may have perceived David as his enemy, but all the way through 1 Samuel, we saw David had never viewed himself as Saul's enemy. Okay, questions, comments, cries of outrage? Yes?
You think he was grieving more for Jonathan and Saul, maybe, as his friend?
Yes. I don't know if that's a hard question to answer, because every time he mentions sorrow, grief in the song that he writes and here in the narrative, it mentions all three, Israel, Jonathan, and Saul. So it says, he wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan, his son, and for the people of the Lord. And when we get to the song in just a minute, it's gonna focus on Saul and Jonathan, and we're gonna see some very hard to explain things, and so I'm gonna need your input as we talk about that. I do think toward the end of his song, he really focuses on Jonathan. So that really breaks his heart about Jonathan because of the covenant they made together. But all the way through it says he's grieving for Saul, and Saul is God's anointed, and he lauds Saul and Jonathan as both beautiful and honorable and all those things. So we'll talk about that as we get to it. But yeah, I think that he was particularly, hey Dana, how's it going? Good to see you. Particularly grieved over Jonathan, yes. But Saul is also mentioned all the way through. So, after the time of grieving, it says they mourned, they fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan. After this time of grieving is over, David wants to confirm just a tiny little detail in the messenger's story. And here, if you're old enough to remember, I think David's kind of like Columbo. He's like, hold on just a minute, He says, and David said to the young man who told him he says, where do you come from? He said, now, didn't you say you were an Amalekite? Well, where do you come from? How is this happening? How are you there? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. And so, I read this, I think of them all sitting around the campfire after the grieving session, and David say, okay, now where did you say you come? Didn't you mention you were an Amalekite? And what were you doing in the camp of Israel is kind of the picture you get in this question. Doesn't really make sense. You're an Amalekite, but yet you were there when Saul died. The messenger clarifies by saying, I'm the son of a sojourner. Your translation might say the son of an alien, a son of a foreigner. The word translated sojourner is always mostly translated resident alien in the Old Testament law. So it says when the resident alien comes to live among you, you are to treat them with it. So what's happening here, this guy is the son of someone who was part of Israel, but whose father was not a Hebrew. He was brought in as an alien into the company of Israel. So this wasn't just a free wandering Amalekite that just happened upon Saul on Mount Gilboa. He claims to be part of the Hebrews, and by implication, part of the army of the Hebrews. And so he asks, David is wanting to know, is this guy just some foreigner out there that's just wandering around and found Saul and didn't know any better? Or is he like part of Israel? The guy says, I'm the son of a sojourner, meaning I'm part of Israel, just not Hebrew by blood. And David asks this because if the guy is part of Israel, if he is been brought into the people of Israel, even as a foreigner, he should have known better. And verse 14, David says to him, okay, if that's the case, how is it that you are not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? He's saying, if you're part of Israel, you should have known how holy and sacred God's anointed is. Whether we're talking about the king, whether we're talking about the priest, or God's anointed is holy before the Lord. David had certainly refused to kill him twice. Saul's armor bearer wouldn't do it either. He knew how holy this office was. So how did you, Mr. Amalekite, who lives among the Israelites, how did you not seem to have a problem with putting your hand against the Lord's anointed? I would have loved to have known how the guy answered, but he doesn't get a chance to. As soon as he says this, then David called one of the soldiers and said, come here and strike him down. So he struck him down and he died. That's the whole, I love how quick it's like, he didn't say nothing. He just died. David said to him, your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have put the Lord's anointed to death. And so David had him killed. Okay. That seems a little extreme to us, doesn't it? No? Okay. Tell me why. That's just knee-jerk reaction. No, it's not extreme. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. It seems extreme to us. So let's say for a moment, I believe that he's lying. And it happened like it said in 1 Samuel 31. David doesn't know that. All David knows is what this guy told him. So let's say for a moment in David's mind, he really did kill Saul. That's what David knew. So according to his story, this guy was just doing what Saul asked him to do. And he spared Saul more suffering. That seems kind of like a kindness to us. It's what Saul wanted. He even asked his armor bearer to do it. It may not have seemed wrong to him, may not seem wrong to us, but it was an outrage to David. And the reason we are more shocked that David had this man executed than we are about the guy lifting his hand against God's anointed is because we don't value the concept of God's holiness as much as David and Saul's armor bearer did. So David thought more of Saul than we do. And why is that? Because he's the Lord's anointed. The term anointed in Hebrew is what? Messiah. The term anointed one in Greek is Christ. Yeah. So David knows that the anointed one, that this office that God had established, it's holy to the Lord. It's to be honored. Even if the guy is wicked that's in it. That's why David wouldn't raise his hand to him. It's God's place to install or remove the one whom he anoints. And taking action to do so by your own hand, it's like touching the ark of God. It's like defiling the holy tabernacle. It's the death penalty. It's a breach of God's holiness. And all through the Old Testament, a breach of God's holiness, it requires the death penalty. For the priests who offered the strange fire, the unclean incense in the tabernacle, they were killed. For Uzzah, who reached his hand out to touch the ark for a very good reason, to keep it from falling off the ox cart, death. Transgressing God's holiness is what David accuses this guy of, what he did. And he says, your blood is on your own head. Your mouth testified against you, saying, I have put the Lord's anointed to death. For David, it's God's holiness that's at stake here. Okay? Questions, comments, cries of outrage? Sweet. All right, the second part of the chapter is a poem, a psalm. It's a song of lament that David composes. Now, as we read this, I want you to make sure you understand something. This is not David just breaking out into song around the campfire spontaneously like you see in the musicals and stuff on TV. David obviously took time and put thought into intentionally composing this song to give voice to his grief and to allow Israel to grieve. So first, I just want to read 17 and 18, and then we're going to read the whole song. It says, "And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son." So it's Saul and Jonathan. "And he said, it should be taught to the people of Judah, behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. And he said," and then the song starts. Okay? So not only did David grieve and mourn through penning this song, but he commanded that this lament be taught as a national song of grief over the death of Saul and Jonathan. It wasn't just for David. He wrote it to give the people of Israel an outlet to grieve God's king, and for future generations to honor Saul and Jonathan. Now, the book of Jasher, we don't have the book of Jasher, don't technically know exactly what it is. It's also mentioned in Joshua 10, where it says that God stopped the sun for Joshua to win the battle. It says this event is recorded in the book of Jasher. Most people think, and this is not definitive, we don't know for sure, but most people think it's a book of national songs, not spiritual songs like the Psalms, but just national songs that Israel would sing. There's no way I can prove that. That's just consensus. So we're going to read the whole song and then back up and take it a bit at a time. And there's some things in this song I have questions about that y'all are going to have to help me because I don't know the answer. It says this, "Your glory," this is the song, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Let the daughters of the Philistines lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. Your mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, no fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil." And it says, from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. Okay, I have lots of questions. First, before we get back in and just read it again, piece by piece, did you notice that this eulogy, if that's what it is, doesn't say anything negative about Saul at all? There isn't even a hint of any of the evil or unfaithful things Saul did against David, against Israel, against God. Why? If you're waiting on me to give you the answer, I have no idea. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all.
Do you think it's maybe that no matter how bad dad is, kids sometimes have a hard time talking bad about them, and in this case, Saul, I know it's God helping David with Goliath, but from Goliath on, in the beginning, Saul was bringing him in, and he wasn't a shepherd, he was part of this, and maybe he just felt loyalty in the beginning, even though, he thought maybe he was still get favored at some point.
Yeah. So Tim said, just at the very beginning, Saul was good to David. It was a very short time that he was good to David. He as soon as they were coming back from killing Goliath and women started singing, David's killed his tens of thousands, Saul was angry. But Tim said it could be that he saw him as a father figure. He wasn't going to speak ill of the dead, things like that. I've read a couple of people that say, if you're lamenting the king and lamenting God's anointed, you just don't say anything bad. You want to be the good to be remembered. Okay, I don't know about that, but reminds me of that joke. The joke about the funeral. I better not tell that joke. So this guy, the town drunk who everybody hated, and he was terrible to everybody. He died, and his rich brother came into town, and the preacher was going to do this funeral for the town, and the rich brother said, "Listen, you're going to say that my brother was a saint." And he said, "Man, your brother was a hellion. Your brother was terrible. He never confessed Christ. He was mean to everybody. He was a drunk. Everybody knows that he was a terrible person." He said, "I'm going to write you a check for $1 million, and you're going to say he's a saint." And so at the funeral, the guy said, "Y'all know that this guy was a drunk, and he was a terrible person, and he was an awful, awful person, but compared to his brother, he's a saint." All right, so that don't have nothing to do with Saul. Is he wrong for leaving out the real history? David, so don't think of it in terms of what Saul did to David. Think of it in terms of what Saul did to Israel, and Saul did to God's name in Israel, and all of the things that... Is David wrong to leave all that out? I don't know the answer to that. So some of you may be yes, some of you may be no. I just don't know. Okay. He's a forgiving person? Yeah, maybe so.
It just looks like he cared more about the reputation of Israel among the foreigners.
Maybe so. Yeah, I didn't think about that. She said he might have lauded Saul and left out the bad because he cared about God's name and the reputation of Israel before the nations and things like that. That's a good point. That's a good point. So in verse 19 and 20, it says, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places." In the context of this song, who is Israel's glory? Saul and Jonathan. Yeah, he calls them Israel's glory. So when these men were cut down, Israel's glory, Israel's honor was cut down in the lyric of this psalm. And the theme of the psalm is introduced, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." That's a familiar phrase we use a lot, but when we use it, it's like we're saying, yeah, that's how it happens. The bigger you are, the harder you fall. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. But that's not how David means it. This is an exclamation of grief and mourning over Saul and Jonathan's death. Throughout this song, David mourns for Israel, but the focus of the song is on Saul and Jonathan. He calls for the enemies of Israel to be silenced, that Gath and Ashkelon, the two Philistine cities, would not rejoice over Israel's defeat, over the death of Saul and Jonathan. We saw what happened to the bodies of Saul and Jonathan, what they did. They hung them on the wall, disgraceful. He calls out that they would not rejoice, or the daughters of the uncircumcised exult over Israel's defeat, and by extension what they thought, the Philistines thought, was God's defeat. Remember, they put his head in Dagon's temple. They did all of these things, and he then pronounces a curse on Mount Gilboa. I'm trying to hurry up, I'm almost out of time. Mount Gilboa is the place where Saul and Jonathan were killed. Verse 21, he says, "Your mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, no fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil." So he's saying, let this place be cursed. Let it be without rain. Let it be without dew. Let it not produce any offerings. And then he just flat out praises Saul and Jonathan. Here's where I have the biggest problem. "From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back," means he fought to the end. "And the sword of Saul returned not empty." He fought to the end valiantly. And then it says, "Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely." Was Saul beloved and lovely? Maybe to his mama. And then he says, listen to this one. "In life and in death they were not divided. Is that true? Yeah, they were divided a lot, especially as it pertained to David. I mean, there was one time when Jonathan refused to, or when Jonathan didn't know about Saul's oath, Saul almost killed his son. If it wasn't for the army, he would have killed Jonathan. And then when David, when Saul and Jonathan was kind of watching out for David and kind of protecting him, he and Saul were at odds with each other, even screaming at each other, talking about David needs to die, and David and Jonathan saying, no, he doesn't need to die. They were not divided. I don't know. What does your version say?
Mine says, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted.
Oh, okay. So, there's no punctuation in the original manuscripts. It's all just one big text. So in that, what version is that? NASB. In the NASB, the exclamation point behind lovely is not there, and the punctuation goes after life. You see it? So it says, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely in life, and then it says, and in death they were not divided. Now that makes more sense because they got killed together.
Young's literal translation says
Huh?
Young's literal translation says that as well.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe it's just a punctuation issue with the ESV. In death they were not divided. Okay. Now I don't have a problem. That makes more sense. Okay. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Just, poetic language talking about how great they were, how strong and mighty they were. Then he calls Israel to mourn Saul because of all the good that Saul had provided for them. Verse 24, you daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. Saul did. We read, there's a little epilogue right in the middle of Saul's life in 1 Samuel where it talks about all of his military victories, all of the great things that he had done. So those things were real. He was a great military king. He was a terrible spiritual leader and a terrible follower of Yahweh. But David calls them to mourn and remember all the good. And the last verse, it says, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished. Now, you know what I'm going to say, right? Here's one of them verses that everybody uses to claim that David and Jonathan had a homosexual relationship. Okay? When you ever meet somebody that says that, just know they're stupid. They're, as we have seen over and over and over again, well, especially in the parts where it says, they loved each other like their own soul and stuff. David and Jonathan's relationship has already been described all through 1 Samuel as a covenant between brothers. Okay, in 1 Samuel chapters 18 through 20, Jonathan made this covenant with David and renewed the covenant, swore allegiance to David, and extolled his love for David. It's a covenant love that they shared. And when Saul sought to murder David, it was Jonathan who helped David escape in chapter 20, verse 17. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him. It says David loved Jonathan as he loved his own soul. So the word love is here. It's used in other places of covenants between parties. The standard word always all through the Old Testament for like sexual activity is the Old Testament word no. And he knew his wife, and they had it's never used of anything remotely going on with David and Jonathan. And besides the fact, in ancient Jewish culture, still clinging to Mosaic law in the tabernacle and all of those things, homosexuality was unquestionably condemned all through Israel. David, this is describing this special covenant bond between them that surpassed all others, including the love of a woman, a wife. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay, good. Because I don't want to talk about that no more. So, last, this ends the account of Saul. If they would have asked my opinion, chapter 1 here should have gone with 1 Samuel, but they didn't ask. This is the end of the account of Saul. Next chapter is going to begin focusing exclusively on David, and as you saw in the video, the rise and wonderful things David does, and then dips down into sin and all of those things. So we'll see that. So before we go, I guess it's time to go. Does anybody have what applications would you draw from this? Okay, that's what I thought too. All right, let's pray. Father, we do love you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for who you are, God. We thank you for, God, we thank you for the blessing of knowing that the heroes that you chose all through the scripture are sinners just like we are. God, thank you for your true king, your true anointed one, who is the offspring of David, the fulfillment of the promise. Thank you, God, that he never erred, never sinned, God, and he is able to do what Saul and what David were not able to do, to lead your people back to your throne. God, we thank you for his death, resurrection. We thank you for sending your son to die on the cross for us, God, and we pray that you would help us to learn how to grieve in this as David grieves for Saul. Help us to understand rightly what it means to share covenant love with one another as brothers and sisters. God, there's so many things that we could take from this episode, but the main thing, God, is that you've given us your King, and we are so blessed by your grace. And by the salvation that you've given us, God. I pray that you would go with us from here, keep us safe, God, be with VBS, and God, help us to rightly divide your word as we preach the gospel to a bunch of children that are going to be coming. And God, we pray that you would move and save souls among us. We love you and we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.